Hey friends, I've been a bit withdrawn lately with concerns over personal matters. As I tend to do, I retreated into self-absorbed uselessness. I did get 3 lectures organized for my new fall class though, so that's something. And I also started thinking about a far less productive question. What the heck happened to the new atheism? I used to be loosely associated with that movement, although nowadays I'm more inclined to repudiate it. You might be thinking, what do I mean, loosely associated? I was a cheerleader for New Atheism. I shared stages with Dawkins, and I knew Hitchens socially, and I was in way too many circumstances where I had to work actively to avoid Harris. I don't get to avoid the taint now. I do have one excuse, though, and it's a good one. I've been digging into the criticisms of the New Atheism, and one of the common assumptions is that it is a movement of just 4 people. As I found was frequently affirmed by the critics, it was a cult of personality, and it was not particularly interested in broadening its appeal. We had the 4 horsemen, and that was it. Take it or leave it. And they sucked all the air out of the room. If you weren't one of the big 4, you weren't actually a new atheist. Now, fortunately, their influence has greatly abated. 2 of them are dead. One is reduced to making ASMR podcasts for New Age racists. And the 4th is a cranky pants bigot making excuses for cultural Christianity because he doesn't like Muslims. It's not a pretty end to something that was briefly hot a decade ago. And I think it's safe to say the legacy of the New Atheism is non-existent. And that's a real shame, because for the last couple of days I've been reading and listening to the arguments provoked in response to the New Atheists, and they are damn bad. Recently, many Christians have been crowing about the failure of the New Atheism, and that's fair, but mostly they're doing the equivalent of an ad hominem, announcing that atheism has been defeated because those 4 horsemen were flawed and sometimes said incredibly stupid things. That's also sort of fair because that quartet of poor representatives were the self-appointed leaders of atheism. But at the same time, that provides theists an excuse to avoid the valid points that atheism does bring up. I guarantee you that from now on, every Christian apologist is going to use the "but Dawkins" excuse to rebut any point we mention. They already are. So let's look way back to the early days of the New Atheism, when there were all kinds of awful criticisms presented as if they were fresh and new and cogent. Nothing has changed. They're still using these same arguments. For instance, here's Keith Ward, a Christian philosopher from Oxford, who makes a series of claims about atheism that ought to embarrass any philosopher.
What is new about these new atheists? Atheism is actually not very new. I mean, there have always been atheists in the world, but no philosopher of any note has ever been an atheist until Nietzsche. Thomas Hobbes possibly, but he didn't write about metaphysics. So all the classical philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Leibniz, Spinoza, Descartes, Kant, Hegel, the whole canon of Western philosophy has been theistic, has taken the most rational view of the universe to be one which sees the universe as created by an intelligent creator, by God. Nietzsche wasn't, I think, a great philosopher. He was a great aphorist.
He's right about one thing. Atheism isn't new. But should we attach any significance to the missing atheist philosophers? Oxford didn't allow non-Christians to enroll until 1871, and women weren't formally admitted until 1920. Is it surprising that the canon he loves is pretty much exclusively theistic and male?
And he, of course, did say God is dead. But the new atheism has only got going with a particular interpretation of modern science. It's a peculiar interpretation, and tonight I shall argue it's already obsolete as an interpretation of science. And it's interesting that most people who claim that science is atheistic are not physicists or mathematicians. They're zoologists, as Richard Dawkins is, or biologists. In other words, they deal with dirty stuff in laboratories that make funny smells, and they don't concern themselves with the real, tough, ultimate matter of the universe as physicists do. I shall elaborate on that a little bit further.
Oh, those damn dirty, stinking biologists. What do they know? Only physics counts.
But let me quote one person, Richard Lowenton from the United States, who says this: we, I don't know who the we is, it's him and his friends really, we take the side of science because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Moreover, that commitment is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. That statement was made by Lowenton, who is a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, in a book review, but still, he presumably meant it. So science has a prior commitment to materialism, does it? That's the question I want to consider.
Minor point. Lowenton did not have a Nobel Prize. Do your research, Keith. The we refers to scientists broadly, not just a few of Lowenton's good buddies at Harvard. Scientists do not answer questions by invoking ghosts, gods, or devils. Scientific answers propose natural, testable causes. They don't preclude the possibility of forces with which we are unfamiliar. Maybe ghosts do exist. But you don't get to address hypotheses by invoking undemonstrable phenomena. The building blocks of any useful explanation have to be shown to exist before you can deploy them. This is a fundamental point that theists desperately want to ignore. They want to believe that God is a valid component of a scientific explanation while not presenting any evidence that God exists. But Ward is about to dive deeper into this nonsensical interpretation of science. Just wait for it.
And I would argue that actually modern science, far from having a commitment to materialism, undermines materialism comprehensively. But of course not in biology, which is not really concerned with questions like that, but in physics, where the notion of matter has become extremely obscure. Physicists wouldn't use the word matter, in fact. They would prefer to use the word energy. Matter is one possible form of energy, as we know from the one equation that everybody knows, E equals mc squared. So matter is actually interchangeable with energy, and there are many other forms of energy. And most physicists these days agree there are lots of immaterial things. Let me give you one example. Supposing you ask the question, as Stephen Hawking does, for example, how did the universe begin? What accounts for the Big Bang 13.7 thousand million years ago? That's when the universe began. It was very, very small, infinite density, infinite mass, and it exploded, expanded into the universe we now have over that period of time. But it's a proper question in science. How can we explain how it began? If you can't explain it, then science has come to an end. You say.
Materialism is now all about studying dirt and smells. Biologists haven't gotten the lesson about energy yet. Physicists have heard of energy, while biologists haven't. So all those atheist biologists are missing out. Isn't it odd that a greater percentage of physicists are atheists than are biologists? Strange. It's as if knowing what energy is doesn't immediately turn you into a God believer. Ward is just going to redefine cosmology into the study of the supernatural. Actually, studying any hypothesis that doesn't have a final definitive answer must mean that you are a supernaturalist. Also, never ever lecture on the philosophy of science if you think that not knowing an answer means science has come to an end. That is incredibly wrong. So these kinds of ignorant clowns are what we had to deal with in the early days of the new atheism. I hope you don't think that kind of BS is what crushed the movement, though, because that just pissed atheists off of all flavors. And unfortunately, the theistic arguments haven't gotten any better. Back in the day, I often got comments about how I need to deal with the sophisticated philosophical theism that smarter, better theists are proposing. And I tried. I was always disappointed. One of the names that constantly came up was David Bentley Hart, a particularly long-winded theist who would ramble on and on about how all the atheists are making bad arguments. But instead of actually addressing those arguments, he'd throw more words that explain nothing at them.
In recent years, we've seen a little cottage industry spring up in marketing very bad arguments for atheism. So then my reaction is ill-concealed scorn. I mean, the sort of arguments you say you would find in Richard Dawkins, in which he clearly misunderstands claims about ontological contingency and thinks you can conjure them away by having a sufficiently comprehensive cosmology, or that when he says something like, evolution answers the question of existence. That's actually something he says. I mean, you realize there that you're dealing with category errors so profound that they verge on the infinite.
He thinks ontological contingency is something an evolutionary biologist does not understand. That's bonkers. It's what evolutionary biologists do, studying the relationships between categories of things and demonstrating the history of change. It's what physicists do too. And yes, evolution answers the question of existence. I believe that what he's trying to get at is that evolution doesn't answer the question of the meaning of existence. At least not to his satisfaction. But that's because the answer evolution gives is that there's no higher meaning to our existence. Tough. It's typical, though, that a theist would have an a priori assumption about what purpose we're supposed to have and is unhappy that we don't satisfy that assumption, and in fact state that his beliefs are not relevant to any discussion of our nature. Hart has other objections, though. He thinks that the new atheists had a shallow understanding of what religion is, and I actually agree with him. The atheist objection is to the kind of theism we've been taught by theists. Whose fault is that? Somehow we're supposed to believe that there is a sophisticated, intelligent theism, which Hart represents, that plainly silences all the criticisms atheists make. Now, I'm no fan of David Bentley Hart, but this is pure, raw nonsense.
Dawkins and Hitchens both hold up these stories, and Dawkins especially. So, well, but of course, people take the Bible is supposed to be understood as a moral guide. When in Christian history, before, well, it may be true in certain fundamentalist circles, we breed every kind of exotic flora here. So, but all the church fathers, said, well, of course, we read this allegorically, and they didn't, and that doesn't mean reading it as if you believe there are messages encoded secretly in the text. It's just the ancient understanding of it. It serves as a spiritual text to the degree that the mind of Christians read it and allegorize it in relation to the truth that they believed was revealed in Christ. But all the church fathers, all the great medieval theologians, they were quite aware that the God often, of course, not the God of the Old Testament, as if there's only one depiction. I mean, the God of the prophets, many of the prophets, is much more urbane, let's say, than some of the patriarchal narratives. This is no surprise, and it's only if you think that the history of Christian exegesis takes the Bible, say, as a verbatim, the way a very pious fundamentalist Muslim is expected to understand the Quran as a verbatim sort of set of oracles from God, that's a problem. If you do impose the sort of clod-hopping modern sense that, it must be that whatever the intention of the author was is what the text means, and that's how it's always been. Not only Christians, but pagans and Jews in antiquity wouldn't have known what you were talking about. That's just not how texts were read. That's not how they were understood.
Great. The Bible is allegorical. We know. We atheists don't accept it as literal. And when we point out the contradictions and fallacies that emerge if you do take it literally, that's to illustrate the error of taking it literally. Only fundamentalists and clodhoppers would think that it is a moral guide, or that it is univocal, or that the intent is transparent and plainly stated. I agree 100%. It would totally silence atheist criticisms if Christian faiths could also agree that there is ambiguity and flexibility in a cultural context to their holy book. But, they don't. Does Hart never read the news? Also, does he read history? Those church fathers and medieval theologians worked the business of Bible interpretation to the hilt. To go way back, the Arian and Athanasian conflicts were all about interpreting the allegories of the Bible in such ways to grant certain factions power, and wars were fought and people killed over it. Don't try to even imply that medieval theologians were open-minded and aware of how literal words could be manipulated and used as a pretext to outright kill people. They knew and did exactly that. Okay, let's concede that the Bible is not a literal code of moral behavior. That's totally compatible with the atheist position. It's an allegory. Okay, that doesn't dispense with the atheist objection, because even within that, sophisticated theologians can invent all kinds of unwarranted fantasies. So here's David Bentley Hart. He wants to argue that God is actually a real person, whatever that means.
The God is, in fact, infinitely personal, more personal than we are. If anything, we're fragmented and isolated instances of personal relation which are never complete, at least in this life. My objection is to those who think of God as a large psychological subjectivity, who think that God has to be thought of as somebody who goes through changes of temperament or makes choices or experiences pathos in order to be a person. But none of the theistic traditions deny the personal nature of God in the most vital sense, which is that God really knows and loves and is related to us.
So there you have it, sophisticated theology. Unfortunately, this crude, unsophisticated atheism is just going to ask, how do you know that God loves us? Where is the evidence that this gaseous vertebrate is related to us? How do you know? Are you even aware that the real killer argument that atheists have is epistemological? I suspect he'd answer those simple questions with word salad, or just an appeal to the traditions of the church fathers. These are old atheist questions that have never received a satisfactory answer. Their objections are old and tired. How about if we look at more recent theistic claims? Surely they've evolved to a higher plane by now, he says sarcastically. One problem. Theists like Stephen Meyer don't believe in evolution. Just listen to this litany of assertions.
Anyway, I think Professor Dawkins has slightly overplayed his hand with his rabid scientific atheism. And I don't think that the so-called new atheists are in any way winning the argument. And they had a lot of momentum around 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, but I think they've massively overplayed their hand. And I think actually on merits, the proponents of intelligent design and the broader, I think, theistic interpretation of scientific evidence is beginning to win the day. Scientific atheism has become very weird. We often judge the merits of a hypothesis. One among many criteria for judging the merits of a hypothesis is the degree to which it is parsimonious, that it does not multiply endlessly unnecessary theoretical postulates or entities, the Occam's razor principle. But scientific atheism, in order to save the appearances, to explain the data, has had to invent increasingly exotic postulations. So when you have we were just talking about one, you've got the evidence of the digital code in the DNA, and this has not been well explained by chance or necessity, physical chemical necessity, or prebiotic natural selection, or the RNA world, or many different attempts have been made to explain this naturalistically, and they've failed. And so scientific atheists have been forced to posit space alien designers. And then when it seems as exotic to their listeners as it is, well, then they backtrack.
That is so weird to hear and tells you how disconnected from reality these creationists are. No, intelligent design is not winning. It's been sinking since the Kitzmiller decision and has no credibility beyond a tiny group of cranks. Scientific atheism does not violate Occam's razor. Our limitation is that we cannot invent causes without evidence. Entirely unlike intelligent design crowd, which postulates an ever-shrinking universal intelligence that directs the course of life on Earth while being unable to demonstrate such an entity. And no, we're not forced to posit space alien designers. Being able to say that that is a possibility, but that no one has provided evidence for such a thing, is where we are showing a commitment to the principle of parsimony. Okay, you want to suggest aliens? I won't reject it a priori, but now you have to show me why I should think that that is reasonable. And I'm sorry, but I saved the worst for last. Yeah, Stephen Meyer is really bad. But you know what's worse? Dave Rubin, one of the most insipid YouTube pundits out there, and he's interviewing Frank Turek, a terrible, repetitive, and unoriginal Christian apologist. He's one of the biggest clodhoppers you'll find, making excuses for Jesus.
That there seems to be something interesting happening with the atheist movement, if we can call it a movement. I mean, in essence, it has basically fallen apart. From Sam Harris sort of disappearing off Twitter and having, a lot of political problems, that whole Four Horsemen thing sort of disappeared.
True enough, the Four Horsemen thing has sort of disappeared. But that's not atheism. That's one small, showy part of atheism. The political problems bit is mildly amusing. Yes, part of the weakness of the new atheism was political, because they were rapidly drifting off to the right-wing territory. Anti-immigration, pro-racism, pseudo-historical justifications for bad ideas. The same thing Dave Rubin is guilty of. I guess I'll have to accept the validity of the criticism that the new atheists faded away because they became more Dave Rubin-esque.
New atheist movement. I don't know if you've seen that the president of the, Atheists of America, David Silverman, has basically come out and said that the atheist movement was a failure. This is just in the last 2 or 3 weeks or so. I've seen other well-known atheists like Skeptic, my friend Michael Shermer, talk about how there is a purpose and a need for religion. People fill that up with something else. And of course, Jordan Peterson talking about how people end up believing whether they believe it or not. So there's something interesting culturally happening right now, which is sort of why I wanted to bring you on. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, just sort of what's happening.
All right. The sources for the demise of the new atheism, according to Dave Rubin, are 1. Dave Silverman, former president of the American Atheists, who was thrown out for sexual assault and for his rumored misappropriation of the organization's funds. 2. Michael Shermer, the libertarian head of a skeptic organization who was credibly accused of committing sexual assault. 3. Jordan Peterson, right-wing loony, not accused of sexual assault, fortunately, but a deeply deranged guy who wears the costume of a supervillain from the Batman comics. That's Dave Rubin, always right on top of the relevant news.
Right now.
I think that the new atheist movement, Dave, was a reaction to 9/11. Because at the time, the new atheists at the time were Christopher Hitchens. I had a couple of opportunities to debate him in the 2000s, late 2000s. also Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris.
Even
and
Dawkins,
Daniel
I don't know if
Dennett.
I hate to admit it, but Frank Turek gets one thing right. Yes, the new atheism was spawned as a reaction to 9/11. In particular, Sam Harris led the charge with his virulent anti-Islam sentiment. Dawkins happily joined in and has been getting progressively worse as his brain rot grows. And I've even heard Dan Dennett propose violent solutions to the Islamic menace. Behind the scenes at meetings, of course. It's weird to see that view discussed as a strike against the new atheists. I think it is a strike against them. But it's weird to hear it discussed by a couple of people who are just as viciously anti-Islam, if not more so. The new atheists were agreeing with and converging on your position, guys. Why are you bothered by that?
you've seen it in the last couple
Well,
of
I
weeks.
heard
has said,
you had a podcast not long ago where you were talking about how Dawkins has basically said that, well, religion does have some benefits to society.
Yeah.
And I think he's realizing, too, that in Britain in particular, a tepid secularism is not going to resist a radical Islam. But Christianity could be, just from a pragmatic point of view, from his point of view, can maybe blunt radical Islam. So he's realizing there's some pragmatic uses to religion. But I think originally the new atheism came out of 9/11.
See what I mean? Some atheists support Christianity as a bulwark against Islam because Christians are even worse on this point than most atheists. Lovely. You can stop wondering why I'm not welcoming this alliance between new atheists and Islamophobic Christians. Also, do I need to point out that supporting Christianity from a pragmatic point of view is not at all making a case that Christianity is true? My version of atheism considers truth, as near as we can get to it, fundamental. I guess some new atheists and some evangelical Christians consider that secondary and the value of hating others with differing backgrounds to be primary. Oh, and we're going to get the usual tired complaint that atheism has become woke, which is why it's fading away. I'll listen to that when one of these guys can define woke.
it's interesting because what you're describing as the Christian sort of argument as the pushback against radical Islam, I think what we have here is the pushback against wokeism.
Yes.
That people, and this is what David Silverman from the American Atheist was saying, he did not realize that wokeism was going to become, I think he called it a cult, not a religion. And I think that's sort of what brings us to this moment in America.
Yes, and Silverman was the president of the American Atheist. In fact, I had a debate with him probably 7 or 8 years ago. But then he left that role. I don't even know what he's doing now. I mean, the whole movement maybe has pretty much evaporated, really.
Yeah.
Hey, I know what happened to Silverman. He was fired from American Atheists amid allegations of financial conflicts and sexual assault. I guess opposing those things is something only a woke organization would do. Last I heard, he was an insurance salesman in Seattle, and he's still on Twitter, raging against gays, trans people, and Palestinians, and is on the board of Atheists for Liberty, the conservative libertarian organization. He has a lot in common with Rubin and Turek. They should invite him back on their show. And that's why New Atheism failed. It only looks like it evaporated if you can only see the most regressive elements of the movement. Okay, that's enough. Well, now you can see how my brain works when I'm forced to deal with grief and probate lawyers. It makes me cranky. I'll get better soon. But you better not click on the like or subscribe buttons. It'll only encourage me. But once again, thanks to all my supporters on Patreon. I'd rather be talking about spiders than theists, you know.